Hello folks, now what have I got here? Well, this is in fact a Call of Duty Wheelson PC. Now, when on earth did we make this? Well, actually we built it quite a long time ago, back when we were doing the Bloodlines build. So you may recall there was a little bit of a blip between some of the videos. There was actually quite a long gap. And actually that is exactly when this thing was made. So I had a really short time to do this for the release of the game. So NVIDIA wanted to have a build done for the live kind of event over in central London. And what they wanted was a PC that was going to show exactly what Call of Duty was about. And actually they asked for something a little bit different. So they asked for a Call of Duty Wheelson. Not the easiest thing in the world to ask for, but it was a really interesting build to do. And I'm going to be talking through basically what was done. Unfortunately, I didn't really get the chance to film it because the deadline was really tight. I had about between 1.5 and 2 weeks to design and build the entire PC. Well, how is this thing actually made? Well, the majority of the structure is made out of 10mm acrylic. So all these sections over here are all made out of 10mm acrylic, and it's held together using a combination of those little modding cubes that I tend to use, and also the 3D printed brackets. So the majority of the interior of the case is actually 3D printed to be able to have a structural sort of shape with all these different angles. Because obviously trying to CNC machine things is really quite difficult if you haven't got like a 4th or a 5th axis like me. So I've just got a 3-axis machine. So trying to do very shallow angles takes a very long time. And I didn't really have that time. So instead, what I did is I worked to using flat edges on the machine, and then everything else was 3D printed. So parts like this here and these parts, these were all 3D printed. These wheels, these were all 3D modeled in Cinema 4D and then 3D printed on my Prusa i3 printers. So there's 6 of them in total. And these wheels themselves are quite an interesting assembly. So obviously I wanted this thing to be able to roll like this. Fortunately, I couldn't make it motorized due to the lack of time. But to do that, that meant I had to have a separate wheel and axle assembly. So what I did for that is we created the wheels first. So these are 3D printed out of PLA. So I just wanted to, if you notice the shape itself with all the hexagons and things, you can have a lot of stringing if you use maybe PETG or some of the other tougher filaments. So I went with PLA to get the smoothest print possible. It would also be easy to paint afterwards and make it look kind of authentic. But the hubs and other structural elements I've printed in PETG. Now, that means they should be a little bit more hard wearing, and they're not going to have issues with delamination as much as PLA can have. And basically the way that the wheels attach is on the sides here you've got a separate hub assembly underneath the wheel caps. These then attach to these steel axles. The axles are held in place using set screws, which I built onto the inside here. So this compartment down here, these are all 3D printed as well. And then on the inside, to allow it to roll freely, instead of having it grinding it into material, I've put some 608 ZZ bearings on the inside there, and that supports the whole way to the build, and that's how it rolls nice and freely like that. But of course, it's not just those little details. The whole thing here then had to be thoroughly primed and then airbrushed. So it's been fully painted up to try and match the sort of in-game color scheme. I did want to do the camo pattern. Unfortunately, we ran out of time, so that was the first thing that I had to sort of admit that I couldn't do in time. Camo is quite difficult, especially with the modern camos, because they're all very angular and lots of squares. So to do that though, I would have just created a vinyl cutout, much like I did with the NVIDIA Battlefield rig that we did a year and a bit ago. And I would have basically just gone over the whole build and then worked it to do that. So up top here we have a 2080 Ti, which is acting as the gun turret, because NVIDIA said that they didn't want to have weapons visible in the video. Instead, so we're going to use the 2080 Ti as the platform for it basically, along with a custom cable. So this cable here links all the way into the build itself, into the other cables from the Corsair power supply on the inside. That means that when you need to transport this thing, this turret can just be unscrewed, goes into the case, and then it can be all transported safely. Same thing, these wheels just come off with little set screws that I mentioned earlier. You just pop them off, and then you can pop it into the carry case that we just taken it out of, and it makes it safe to ship. But inside is also quite a powerhouse. So we've got an X570 DTX motherboard, so that's the Asus ROG Impact. And we've also got obviously a 2080 Ti on the top. We've got a Corsair NVMe 2TB SSD, so it's a PCIe 4 MP600 SSD on the inside of that. And then, believe it or not, this thing actually cools pretty well because we've got a big Noctua cooler on the inside. Just about fits, there's not a whole lot of clearance. I would show you what it looks like, but unfortunately it's quite difficult to take the top apart because of all these cables on the outside. But basically we have vents on the undersides and the front and the sides here. And these have got Noctua 80mm Redux fans that go attached to one of their PWM splitters. That then pulls fresh air in through the front, goes over the heatsink, and then you've got around the back a 92mm Noctua and another 80mm at the back for exhaust. So actually you've got really quite efficient airflow going right the way through the front, all the way to the back. And because we've got an ITX sort of SFX power supply on the inside, there's not a whole lot of cabling to worry about, so actually the airflow is pretty unimpeded. So one of the things I had to be careful about with this build is the fact that it's pretty heavy, you know, so we wanted to make sure that none of the brackets would be overly stressed and have problems with maybe delamination, because if you put too much stress onto a 3D printed part, it's very easy for things to start separating and all that. So the way I managed that was trying to make sure that all the parts are always kept in compression. All the brackets, we don't want to have any parts that could maybe force the layers apart. So I learned that from making the 3D printed spools that you may have seen pop up in a couple videos before. Some of those prototypes had magnets in them, and actually I found when I attached the magnets to the plate on the wall, they would split. So the actual shock and the fact that it's a tight fit would mean that the layers would delaminate, and that's no good. So to avoid that, I made things very thick and then made sure that everything was always kept in compression and didn't push anything apart with the screws. So the rest of it's held together with the modding cubes. I've got 10mm and 12mm ones in there. And then all these other little details. So we've got, for instance, the holdfast, the clamps, the little windows and tow bars and things. These were all 3D printed as well, again in PLA, so we could get a nice sort of just clean print that's easy to print afterwards, easy to paint afterwards. And then all the detailing, like the we've got obviously RTX on written here, the NVidia stamps and things. These were all spray painted on after making decals using a vinyl plotter. But this was really quite a challenging build because obviously we didn't have very much time, and trying to make something as authentic as possible that would be, you know, perfectly good when viewed up close at a live event, that's quite nerve-wracking. So it was really interesting to see how this one came together. So despite the crazy hours, it was a very interesting project, and at the very least, I'm very happy that it does run properly. So this thing is definitely a bit of a beast. And the fact that it functions fully as a proper gaming PC, I think is the cherry on the cake, because it would have been a bit upsetting to make this whole diorama PC and then have it not function properly. But if I were to do one again, maybe with more time, obviously I would definitely add the camo, because I think that's a big part of the identity. I'd have also wanted to build onto the GPU turret here, because as cool as it is having a Founders Edition card, I think it'd be even cooler if we had it fully painted to match the whole mod, maybe have some more bulky parts on here that were 3D printed to add more of the sort of gun turret shape. Heck, maybe even have it move. I think that would be quite an interesting one. Have a separate assembly of wires so that it can be just unplugged very easily, like a socket perhaps. So these are the sort of things that you can do if you have a bit more time. So it would have been interesting to try it out. Maybe in a future build we'll be able to take some of the ideas that we've learned on this one and then use them that. I already know that some of these parts, like the brackets, I used the same principles in the Bloodlines rig, and that was really quite an interesting experience because I got to learn how they worked on this one, and then we used them in the wooden parts on that build as well, and it worked out really, really well. Now, it would have been great to be able to film this thing up fully for you, just to show you the process from start to finish. But fear not, we're going to have some crazy scratch builds coming up just around the corner, so you're not going to miss out really. Plus, this thing's still pretty cool, and hopefully you might get the chance in future events to be able to see it live. So maybe if NVIDIA chooses to display it at some of the Call of Duty stands in future gaming events, it might turn up. Would be cool. But in the meantime, don't forget you can also follow us over on builds.gg, Discord, Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. And I'll catch you next time, folks.